So the main event of the weekend, Oklahoma beating Michigan 24-13. The Palace on the Prairie was rocking for the first time in a while. Great to be able to celebrate a win there. Super cool environment, super cool to watch a game at night. Definitely need to get out to Norman to observe that for myself. And just a really good game. Now, it wasn't like this, we're just coming off a Sunday night football game of the Bills and the Ravens where it's 41-40. It wasn't that kind of game, but you had a lot of hype coming into this game. Two really talented quarterbacks that both of their programs invested a ton in this past offseason. Obviously, Michigan spending a lot of money to get Bryce Underwood to flip from LSU. John Mateer, not just bringing him in from Washington State, but also getting his very talented play caller to come along with him. This was setting the stage for, okay, two great quarterbacks, two teams that should be on the rise. Who's going to stand out above the other? And what it came down to was the team and the coach that put the most faith in that said quarterback. And that was Oklahoma. John Mateer was fantastic on the day, 21-34, 270 yards through the air. He also had 74 yards rushing, 3 total touchdowns. Wasn't an immaculate game. He had his misses. He had a bad interception where he sailed the ball over his target. It wasn't perfect, but man, oh man, was that special. Arm angles, the ability to run between the tackles. You got everything that you wanted out of John Mateer when you pried him away from Washington State. And think about where Oklahoma was a year ago. People were very down on this program, not myself. But they looked at this team and said, man, we're a ways away from competing in college football. I looked at it and I said, well, yeah, some of the numbers defensively don't look great, but a lot of that plays into the fact that this offense kept putting them in bad positions. It was a bad offensive coordinator, a bad quarterback play, injuries to the entire wide receiver room, a shaky offensive line. All you needed to do was give that side of the football a little bit of a facelift, and all of a sudden, complementary football is going to play out in Norman. Mateer was locked in. Arm talent at the collegiate level is special. Like I said, the arm angle, some of the throws that he can make on the run. He's also just such a gritty football player, which I love and appreciate. You want a guy that gets up for his biggest games. And this is only week 2. We still have SEC play coming up. He's going to have plenty of more big games to rise to the occasion for. But 19 carries on the day. He just said, I'm going to do whatever I can to make sure that I'm putting my team in the best position to succeed. So Mateer, you're already getting the early returns on this investment that you paid off. And Arbuckle did a really nice job in this game as well, designing plays to keep Michigan on its toes early. And we talked about that in the game preview. When you have an aggressive Michigan defense where it's all predicated on just see ball, get ball, the best way to counteract that is misdirection before the snap, or to get the defense looking one way but then send them the other way with some RPOs. That helped early on, give Oklahoma the ability to sustain long drives, put up points in the first half. And then as you saw as the game went on, Michigan was so tired of having to keep up with that they lost the battle in the trenches. Game ball has to go. As special as Mateer was, as great as Ben Arbuckle was, the game ball to me in this one goes to the Oklahoma offensive line, because this was a disastrous group last season. Really bad, and still heading into this year, you would look at it as the weakness of this team. The way that they were able to hold its ground early against Michigan, and then in the third and fourth quarter say, no, now we're going to lean on you. You do that to a lot of teams. Michigan, you're known for leaning on teams as the game wears on. We're going to do that to you. There was a final drive here that was, let me find it. 16 plays, lasted 8.5 minutes, eventually led to a field goal that put the game on ice, essentially, and just really painted the picture for, okay, Oklahoma could be a legit player in the playoff conversation. Now, I already knew that. I already believed that. John Mateer was one of my 3 Heisman picks to start the season. Oklahoma, I believe, was my 11th seed in the college football playoffs. I had already bought all my stock. But now that everybody's going to sit here on Monday and Tuesday talking about how great Oklahoma is, they're going to start to see, okay, you've got a great defense. You've got a talented quarterback. Deion Burks out wide is fantastic. Seeing the Oklahoma offensive line take on Michigan's defensive front and win in a multitude of ways really starts to paint the image for where Oklahoma could be heading for a special season. So Mateer was great. Arbuckle was great. Burks, as I already mentioned, was very, very spot on. That's what you want out of your number one target. He was banged up for a lot of last year, played through some injuries for certain points, then got shut down. 7 grabs, 100 yards, and a touchdown. It was just a really impressive win. The only thing that I'd say about Oklahoma, and it's week 2, I'm going to remind myself in this show, we got to take this thing week by week. We can't just say, hey, they beat, Michigan, and it was the only top 25 matchup. So now Oklahoma's going to win the whole damn thing. No, they still have a really tough SEC schedule coming up, and we could be sitting here in the middle of October being like, what happened? We have to remind ourselves to be patient. If I look across this Oklahoma football team and I'm like, where do my concerns lie? The running back room is a real mystery at the moment. And they have a stable of guys. They've got 3 or 4 different guys, but they haven't been effectively running the ball outside of Mateer so far this season. It's just 2 games, but I'm really surprised because I thought it would be a strength of this team, and specifically Jaden Ott. I still need somebody. I've asked it on Twitter a couple of times now. I need somebody to explain to me what is happening with Jaden Ott. He was one of the more impressive running backs in the sport. He was one of the more prized transfer portal additions this past offseason. 2 games in, it has been very lackluster, to say the least. He's not getting a few, more than 4 or 5 touches a game. He was banged up. I remember seeing something about at the beginning of the season, him being a little banged up in fall camp. Maybe they're just slow playing his impact. But if I'm just saying if I'm explaining what I'm watching on the field, the running back room is something where I'm like, I think you're going to need that balance offensively when you get into conference play. Defensively for Oklahoma, we're going to wrap this thing up on their side, talk about Michigan in a second, but I need to bring out the stat of the day. And we're going to put on our nice little nerdy blue light glasses here. The number of the day. So Michigan had a breakaway score from Justice Haynes in the third quarter. I think it was one of the first plays, maybe the first play of the second half, and it went 75 yards for a score. If you take away that run, Michigan had 31 carries on the day for 71 yards. Just 2.29 yards per carry. Outside that one run, that one run did more than half of their run total on the evening. Michigan's defense played this game exactly the way that they should have. They looked at Michigan's roster and they said, okay, your best talent is running the football. Yes, you have a very special quarterback, but he's 18 years old, first road game of his career, first really raucous environment, and they're lacking talent on the perimeter. They're also down their top tight end. And the offensive line, while, you still expect Michigan to have good offensive line play, I wouldn't say it's of the same stature it was 2 to 3 seasons ago. So, Brent Venables is looking at this thing. It's like, okay, well, we've got a really good front 7. Let's just make sure they don't get to 3rd and 2s or 12-play drives or where they're taking the ball away from our offense and not giving us opportunities to respond. They did a really good job selling out on the run. They made Bryce Underwood look like an 18-year-old. We'll talk about him in a second. He obviously had his struggles if you look at the stat sheet. All in all, just a very good day for the Oklahoma defense. Did exactly what they had to do against what is, I believe, a handicapped Michigan offense. Is there anything else that I wanted to say with this game? They trusted their DBs, allowed just 5 catches from wide receivers on the day. Rest of those completions went to running backs and tight ends. One final time I will say this, just to make sure it's clear. Oklahoma starts off the show because they are the story of the weekend. That does not mean that they are all of a sudden this top 5 to 10 team. They still have to face so many teams that will pose such a more significant threat on offense than Michigan did this past weekend. On the schedule, they have Auburn. Really talented wide receivers there. They've got one of the best duos in the nation. They're also run by one of the smarter offensive minds in the sport, Hugh Freeze. Obviously, it's going to be a crazy game with Jackson Arnold coming back to Oklahoma after he had such a bad season, but talented wide receivers at the very least, good offensive line, good play caller. So you have to worry about that game. Texas, who bounced back this past week against San Jose State, I think 38-7. They have really talented wide receivers. They have Steve Sarkisian, one of the best play callers in the sport. That game is on a neutral field. That game you still have to worry about. Tennessee, their offense looks really potent. We get to watch them against a real true test this weekend against Georgia. We'll see how they fare. Joey Aguilar seems to have brought back the deep passing game in Tennessee. Josh Heupel, one of the best play callers in the sport. They also have Alabama, who bounced back as well. I think won 73-0 on Saturday. One of the best wide receiver rooms in the sport. Really talented play caller in Ryan Grubb. That's another challenge. LSU, they also have on the schedule. Really talented wide receiver room. Garrett Nussmeier, one of the best quarterbacks in the sport, maybe the best at the moment. So I just named you 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 games where I'm sitting here today saying, yes, Oklahoma showed me everything I wanted to see from them, but let's get through the middle of October, let's get into November, and I think we'll have a much better idea of who this team really is. So those are my thoughts on the Oklahoma Sooners. For the Michigan side of things here, for the Wolverine, it wasn't this earth-shattering loss. And I think, unless you're a Michigan fan, I think you saw coming into this game that they were going to be at a deficit at some really important positions. I thought that Oklahoma was going to have the edge in the trenches compared to Michigan's offensive line. I thought that the wide receivers were going to get pretty clamped up by Oklahoma's secondary, which they were. I also don't think it's fair to say, because he is 18, but you also have a really young, inexperienced quarterback going into an incredibly tough environment in just his second career game. All things considered, it was still in reach. Michigan wasn't totally out of this thing, despite, being outrushed by Oklahoma, despite being, despite outrushing Oklahoma. They were still the less penalized team. They won the turnover battle. These were these things that paint you to be like, this thing was pretty close, despite all of our issues we have on the roster currently. This was, to me, a game that's almost like a microcosm of Michigan's 2025 season, where you have a really competitive defense, awesome front seven, and a group that will continue to get better as the year goes on. So I still feel really good about that group, even though they had a tough time against Oklahoma's high-octane offense. You also have this phenom at the quarterback position, the most important position in the sport. He's just 18, but you're lying to yourself if you didn't watch that game on Saturday and you didn't check out their game against New Mexico in week 1 and say, man, when this dude gets some pieces around him, and as he gets older and more experienced, he's going to be a problem in this sport. He's going to be one of those guys where you're going into next season saying, yeah, he's probably a top 3 to 5 guy in college football at just the age of 19. So you have the really competitive defense, you have a phenom at quarterback, and then, yes, around him, you're a little weak at the playmaking positions. Wide receiver is definitely down a notch. It has been for a while now, but there's not even when it was down a few years ago, there was still a Roman Wilson that you could trust on a 3rd and 8 across the middle of the field. There were still the really talented tight ends that they had, Colson Loveland this past year. There were still these guys where you could paint the picture of playmakers you could rely on. Maybe they'll get there by the end of this year, but as we could see through the first 2 weeks, they don't have that at the moment. I think they're talented at the running back position. I don't know if it's as big of a stable of guys as it is as much just Justice Haynes at the top and depth behind him. But I'd also argue the offensive line isn't at the same strength that it has been the last few years under the Jim Harbaugh era. So you're stuck in this window. When you have a really talented defense and you have a quarterback that is special but not a lot of help around him, to me, at most this season, you are frisky. You're frisky at best, which is still good to be a top 20, top 15 type team in the nation. They were in my top 16 heading into this week. I don't think I'm going to bump them down all too much. But you're almost looking at this season as okay, well, maybe we can steal a couple of nice wins throughout the schedule. But we're also just kind of let's get to 2026 alive and move forward from there. There's almost we're sitting here waiting because we'll always have the good defense. Bryce Underwood's only going to get better. And then hopefully, in the offseason, you can start plucking away a top receiver from this school. Or, you can get a nice recruit from this school because they want to play for a guy like Bryce Underwood. I think that is where this thing is slowly going. They're still a really competitive team in the Big Ten. They're of a top 4 or 5 caliber team in that conference. But this was kind of this was kind of what you're going to get out of Michigan football all season. Now, against teams that maybe don't have the quarterback play or the offensive coordinator that knows how to dial up against Wink, maybe you can steal a couple of really important wins on the schedule. Maybe you can go to an Ohio State and do what you did to them last year. I'm not saying that you will, but that still is very much in play this season. What I don't think is in play is saying like Michigan is a playoff team and they're a national title contender. That's just where I'm at with them. What else with them? Michigan. I will say this. I do have one bone to pick with the Wolverines, and it is at their head coach position. Sherron Moore is definitely a beloved head coach. His players love playing for him. He comes from a well-developed coaching tree that breeds successful coaches in the sport, both professionally and at the collegiate level. There is something with Sherron as a play caller that is not my cup of tea in the sport. If I'm being led by an offensive mind in the year 2025, I don't know how you could watch Ben Arbuckle call plays and Sherron Moore call plays and say these guys are on the same level. Now, I understand that Sherron is probably in a position where he is thinking about protecting his young quarterback and not putting him in harm's way. But you're doing a disservice to the team in the present, thinking about the future. Run, pass is not an effective way to call any game in this sport. Lack of motion, lack of RPOs, lack of quarterback runs when you have an athlete at that position is not putting your team in a position to win in the year 2025. There's this weird mantra at Michigan where it's because of what Harbaugh installed, where it's Michigan football. It's mean man football. We're going to run it between the tackles 40 times and we're going to win 13-10. Like, that is their style. That works when you have the personnel to fit it. And I don't think right now it's of the same caliber, specifically along the offensive line, specifically when you have those reliable targets out wide when you do need to convert a 3rd and 8. And it just feels like Sherron is kind of holding on to what the Harbaugh era was instead of fitting his scheme to best fit the players that are on the roster right now. Brent Venables put his faith in Ben Arbuckle on Saturday and said, I know I'm this defensive-minded guy. I know I'd love to win games 10-6, but you're a special play caller. You have a special quarterback. I'm going to put the faith in you to do whatever you need to get a win. We're not going to play conservative. We're going to play fast. We're going to play aggressive. We'll slow it down if we need to, but we're going to play into our team's best strengths. And I just don't feel like Sherron Moore is doing that. And it does make me wonder, as the year goes on, if this offense still is doing the basic run, pass, and you're not using Underwood's legs. And it doesn't have to be that he's running 10 times, but can you get him on rollouts out of the pocket? Can you get him to do, more things that make the defense think and account for? That'll be something to watch for Michigan in terms of how I feel about them going into 2026, is how this offense continues to develop and fit around the talents of its best players. Again, not an earth-shattering loss for Michigan. I think it was probably something that most people expected, and it just kind of lets us know where they are for the rest of the 2025 season.